We have a particular interest in the category of forgotten horror stories from the Old West here. Stories that have collected dust or have even been forgotten by time, left as a footnote in history, exclusive to their respective regions. Boone Helm, the Kentucky cannibal, was a cold-blooded killer who had a habit of cannibalizing his victims. The Bloody Benders operated a bed and breakfast where they murdered unsuspecting travelers with the help of a trapdoor. Frontier history was brutal on all fronts, but for once, we have a story that incorporates an outlaw who, yes, was terrible, but would be the victim of one of the most gruesome and macabre post-mortem treatments we've ever seen. Who is he? Well, you're looking at him right now. There have been some interesting names handed out amongst the criminal underworld, but George Big Nose Parrott is almost comical. Not just because he indeed had a big nose, but also because Parrott, his actual last name, only enhances the nickname even more. Don't be fooled though. The man was no laughing matter in the 1870s. George was part of a gang of hardcore criminals, robbing, stealing, and killing. And based on reports of drunken ramblings, he even reveled in his job, no matter how gruesome. March 20th, 1834, George Parrott was born, supposedly in Montbéliard, France, just a stone's throw away from the Swiss border, but that's debatable. We don't know even a shred of verifiable information about his upbringing or family, other than the fact his last name may have actually been Parrott, not Parrott, rather gaining the name because of his notably large nose. At some point, he immigrated to the United States and found himself settling somewhere either in Montana or Wyoming. However, as an outlaw on the move, we doubt he ever had a place to truly call home. His earliest recorded crime was that of horse theft in Wyoming, a serious offense, but was acquitted of the charges due to lack of evidence. As George continued pursuing his criminal career, he found himself connected to perhaps the most infamous outlaw network of the Old West, that being the Hole in the Wall, located in Wyoming's Big Horn Mountains, a stronghold located in Johnson County, a place for refuge, shelter, and criminal collaborations. There, George Parrott operated with fellow gang members Dutch Charlie Burris, Frank McKinney, Jack Campbell, Sim Jan, Joe Manus, John Wells, Tom Reed, and Frank Toll, Sim Jan unofficially assuming the role of the leader. Together, the gang became yet another one of the dangers to fear in the old frontier, robbing people, robbing stagecoaches, stealing horses, and rustling cattle throughout Wyoming and the Powder River region. All of these crimes conducted by the men would have easily earned them the end of a rope in the 1870s, but they seem to get along just fine without any major problems, since records don't make note of anything major. Not until August of 1878. On August 17th, Big Nose George and the gang hatched a plan to rob the Union Pacific train carrying payroll in Como, Wyoming, east of Medicine Bow. The plan was to loosen a railroad spike, tie it up with telegraph wire, and pull it out, causing the train to derail as it approached, leaving it vulnerable to rob. But the plan was thwarted. Thanks to the eagle-eyed section inspector Eric Brown, he was able to reverse the rigged railroad spike and alert the law before the train got close. George Parrott and the gang fled when they realized the plan was a bust, and they weren't home free. For the gang, the plan was to hole up near the base of Elk Mountain in a place called Rattlesnake Canyon and lay low until it was safe to move out again. This was about 25 miles from the crime scene at the railroad. However, a more covert approach from law enforcement was at play to apprehend the criminals. On August 19th, Carbon County Deputy Sheriff Robert Whittlefield and Union Pacific Detective Henry Tip Vincent were specially tasked to investigate Rattlesnake Canyon, not to catch the gang, but to scout them. The job was to play the role of stockmen in case they were discovered. And if they spotted the gang, they were to report back to rally up reinforcements. But those men unfortunately never got a chance to. George, Dutch, Frank, and other members gathered around a campfire that evening when a camp lookout informed them of 2 incoming men. They knew what this was, and they weren't going to take any chances. Thinking fast, they doused the campfire, hid behind the brush, and waited for them. Robert Whittlefield and Henry Tip Vincent eventually made it to the campsite. They observed the recently doused fire, knowing they were close, certain they were right on top of them. Then, 7 shots rang out. Robert Whittlefield slumped to the ground, his head riddled with bullets, and the gang made themselves known. Tip Vincent was terrified. Not only had they been outwitted by this gang that they were so sure they'd had the upper hand over, but now he'd been effectively ambushed, his partner brutally killed in front of him. The Union Pacific detective didn't even try to stand his ground. He turned and ran in complete horror. But it was too late from the start. Tip was shot from behind. It was over. George Big Nose Parrott and his band of desperados gathered the bodies of Robert and Tip to loot their bodies of weapons and ammo, as well as one of their horses. Both were buried in shallow graves made of gravel. The gang may have won this round against the law, but little did they know that whatever charges they were facing for the failed railroad robbery were nothing compared to the hole they just dug themselves in. 2 lawmen representing 2 different entities just gunned down in cold blood, and they weren't particularly there to fight either. The outrage this was about to cause was going to be enormous. All they did was buy a little more time. And in all honesty, if George Parrott knew what was going to happen to him further down the line, he may have preferred going down in a gunfight. After days of sending additional scouts to investigate the absence of the lawmen, a pair of them returned with news that a couple of surveyors reported seeing 2 horsemen enter Elk Mountain, followed by a series of 20 or so gunshots. Sheriff Lowry of Rawlins, Wyoming, later organized a posse of 20 men to descend upon the area and look for answers. After 2 days of searching, with the help of local rancher John Foote, their bodies were finally discovered, and according to the Cheyenne Weekly Leader, the final conditions were nothing short of grisly. The August 29th issue reads as follows. On the second day of the search, Whittlefield and Vincent were found. The bodies were much decomposed, and they were doubtlessly murdered a week ago, last Monday. When the surveyors heard the firing, the bodies had been dragged into a dry creek bed, and some brush and gravel thrown over them, partly burying them. They appeared to have been all shot to pieces, with as many as 7 bullet holes being seen in the head of Whittlefield. The scouts, when they were sent out, were directed to play themselves for stockmen, and if they succeeded in coming across the outlaws, not to attempt their capture or any interference, but to come back and report. Every effort will be made now to hunt down and kill these outlaws, and no labor or expense will be spared to that end. It is unfortunate that this search for the missing scouts was not undertaken sooner, as the murderers have now some 10 days head start in which to make their escape out of the country. A $10,000 bounty was placed on the gang's capture. It was later raised to $20,000. Besides Parrott, Dutch Charlie Burris was perhaps the gang's most notable member. He was known for his cruelty and particularly brutal nature as a criminal. He was highly sought after for the Elk Mountain murders, and on December 31st, 1878, 4 months after the killings, he was apprehended by police in Green River, Wyoming, inside of a saloon. His road was at an end, and he was to be transferred back to Rawlins from Laramie via train to stand trial. He was on train number 3, 5 days after his capture, ready to face what would likely be an open and shut case that would end with his death sentence. But little did Burris know that his doom was just a little bit closer than it seemed. On January 5th at 9:25 p.m., train number 3 made a stop at Carbon for passengers when an unexpected angry mob just so happened to be waiting for Dutch Charlie at the station with intent to kill. They were not leaving without the accused in their hands, and they didn't care what the police escort had to say about it. Laramie Deputy Sheriff Ed Kearns was all that stood between Dutch and the mob, and it wouldn't be long before the outlaw was yanked out of the train and promptly hustled to a telegraph pole, where citizens fastened a rope around his neck. Dutch Charlie confessed to his crime in the heat of the moment and begged to be shot instead of hung, but the mob couldn't care less. Dutch was strung up on the pole, hoisted towards the night sky for everyone to see. Later, he was cut down and buried in a shallow grave. Time wasn't going to separate these people from their crimes, not by a long shot. George Big Nose Parrott was next in line to get caught with his pants down, and unlike the newspaper suggested, he didn't exit the country. For his sake, he should have. Parrott was also discovered in a saloon like Dutch Charlie, this time in Miles City, Montana. On July 15, 1880, 1 year and 10 months following the murders, the landlady of George Parrott recognized him from one of the wanted posters spread around the region, his large nose further confirming his identity. The outlaw didn't help his case when he was spotted at the saloon either. He was reportedly drunk and even bragging about his many crimes through the years, one of them including the deadly attack on Deputy Sheriff Robert and Detective Vincent, as well as a recent score he robbed from a military payroll convoy. Miles City lawmen arrested Parrott without incident and contacted Carbon County, Wyoming Sheriff James Rankin and informed him that they had his man at long last. The sheriff made his way to Montana. Sheriff Rankin planned to have Parrott transported via train on a strategic route back to Rawlins, Wyoming, a route more ideal to avoid lynch mobs that went through Omaha, Nebraska, Cheyenne, Laramie, and then through Carbon before stopping at Rawlins. Unfortunately, the train did have to stop at Carbon whether the sheriff liked it or not, which raised a lot of concern. Word about things like this spread around quickly, and with such high emotion attached to this case, the chances of George Parrott ending up like gangmate Dutch Charlie Burris were very likely. They left for Wyoming, and for the time being, the trip was going according to plan. But on August 7th, all hell broke loose. Just as the sheriff feared, it looked as if the town of Carbon received word that Big Nose George was expected to be stopping at the train station that Saturday. A mob of angry masked men rushed the train and frantically searched for where George was being kept. Sheriff Rankin saw them coming and removed his pistol from his holster, ordering the mob to stand back so the man could face trial. Clearly outnumbered, the leader of the mob ordered Rankin to stand aside, hand him the key to Parrott's shackles, and put his hands in the air. The sheriff refused, instead calling on fellow passengers to help keep the prisoner unharmed. It was useless. Someone in the mob grabbed an axe and used it to break off Parrott's binds. The outlaw was grabbed from his seat and hustled out of the train with a rope securely placed around his neck. George remained unusually calm during the violent ordeal, but his demeanor would quickly change as the crowd walked him to a corral. Then they stopped, right beneath a large beam. George looked up and realized what was about to happen, and that's when he unraveled. Hardly able to contain his fear, George Parrott began begging with the mob, telling them that he was not present with the crew who killed Whittlefield and Vincent, supposedly saying, "I do not want to die with a lie in my mouth, and I will tell the truth, so help me God. But give me a little time. I am so badly scared and can hardly talk." But the crowd wasn't having it. They wanted to know the truth, and wouldn't settle for any more half-baked excuses. George had to give them something. Then he owned up to it. Parrott admitted to being at the scene of the crime in Elk Canyon that night and taking part in the murder. He said, "I was in the party who murdered Widowfield and Vincent. The party consisted of Frank Toole, Mac, Dutch Charlie, Jack Campbell, Thomas Reed, Sim Wan, and myself. My name is George Francis Warden," one of his aliases. "I don't know who killed Widowfield. When Widowfield got off his horse to examine the place where our campfire was and said, 'It's hot as hell, we'll catch them before night.' Somebody in our crowd said fire, and our guns being in position, we fired almost simultaneously. I don't know who gave the command to fire. It was almost impossible for us to miss them because they were so close. I think we all fired at Vincent. The horses that belonged to the dead men we took along, they were killed and otherwise disposed of. I heard that Dutch Charlie was hung, Frank Toole was killed in the hills, and Mac died of fever in Yellowstone County." Someone in the mob asked him, "Why did you kill those men?" Parrott responded with, "On the principle that dead men tell no tales." The following question was, "Do you know where the balance of the party is that were with you on the day of the murder?" And Parrott replied, "I do not. We separated the same fall." These answers were definitely more satisfactory, and when someone in the mob told George that the beam he was standing underneath was the very same one that gang member Dutch Charlie hung from, he nearly broke down crying. With this, the mob's leader ordered Big Nose George to be taken back to the train and returned to Sheriff Rankin. The lawman was likely very surprised that his prisoner was still in one piece. George was fastened back into his seat, and the train moved on from Carbon Station. Opposite from his previous demeanor, George Parrott was so overwhelmed that he slid down from his seat and hysterically wept from his close encounter with the mob. A day later, the sheriff and George arrived in Wyoming, where the criminal was secured behind bars. All that was left now was to wait for arraignment. That came on September 13, 1880. When the judge asked how he'd plead, George said guilty. The judge made it clear that the punishment for first-degree murder would be death, but Parrott reiterated that his plea was guilty, with tears in his eyes. A reporter with the Carbon County Journal came in to interview George in his cell shortly after, where he provided a more detailed account of the murders that occurred almost 2 years ago. Still using his alias, George Francis Warden, the outlaw told the reporter, "Our party, consisting of Frank Toole, Mac, Dutch Charlie, Jack Campbell, Thomas Reed, Sim Wan, and myself, we pulled the spikes that held the rail, but the crowbar being a short one, we could not pry out the rail. We laid all day in a gully nearby and watched the section men at work. They did not discover the rail had been tampered with until just as they were about to leave in the evening. 2 of our party went into Medicine Bow Station and purchased provisions. When we left, we proceeded directly to Elk Mountain. The first we saw of Widowfield and Vincent, they were about a mile off, but we shortly made out that they were men and were making directly for our camp. After a hurried consultation, it was decided to hide our stock in the brush and conceal ourselves and let the men pass should they not be officers, and to kill them should they be such. As we expected, they would say something to give us an idea as to who they were. They rode up the trail to our campfire when the large man, Widowfield, got off his horse and stuck his hand into the fire, remarking, "It's hot as hell. They have been here, and we will catch them before long." One of our party had a lame horse for which he had been fixing a pair of shoes, and Widowfield picked up the corks, which had been cut off, saying they were heads of railroad spikes. Frank Toole, one of our party, then said, "Let's fire," and loud enough for all to hear, part of us shooting at the man on the ground and part at the man on the horse. I fired at the man on the horse. After our volley, the horses and rider ran about 50 yards when the latter fell off his horse and attempted to get up, holding his gun in his hands. Some 20 shots were fired at him, and firing only ceased when we were certain he was dead. Jack Campbell took Widowfield's boots, and Dutch Charlie the best saddle. After taking what valuables they had, we got scared and did not know what to do with the bodies, but finally concluded to carry them down in the brush and cover them up, which we did. We immediately broke camp, made down the canyon the same way we went up, and started north. We crossed the railroad at Carbon and the Platte River about 2 miles above the mouth of the Muddy. Sim Wan was the leader of the party, he being acquainted with the country. One of the party, called Mac, who was with us, claimed to be one of the James brothers, referring to Jesse and Frank James. I left the party on Goose Creek, where it broke up. 4 days later, George changed his plea to not guilty. On November 17th, a special grand jury was called to examine witnesses and confirm that the lawmen's deaths were indeed murders from gunshot wounds, cross-examining the claims made by George Big Nose Parrott. On December 15th, George was found guilty of the murders of Rob Whittlefield and Tip Vincent. He was scheduled to hang on April 2nd, 1881, between the hours of 10 and 4 p.m. His fate was finally sealed. Parrott didn't wait for that time to come, though. Ever since he was caught, he seemed rather well behaved, but that was likely in an effort to portray himself as an innocent man. Now that all other options were off the table, he made his next move. On March 22nd, 1881, 3 months after the verdict, George Big Nose Parrott somehow got his hands on a pocket knife and a piece of sandstone, and by this point spent 3 days filing down the rivets on his shackles and successfully broke out of his binds behind bars. Some sources say that he waited in his cell for the sheriff to eventually check on him, but more reliable historical records point to George actually exiting his cell when the coast was clear, hiding in the jail's washroom, and knocking Rankin over the head with his shackles. Either way, the sheriff was knocked out cold, and Parrott had a window of opportunity. Or so he thought. At the very same time this was happening, Sheriff Robert Rankin's wife, Rosa, just so happened to be bringing in a nightly meal to George and saw what he was trying to do. She thought fast. Rosa grabbed her revolver, burst inside the jail, and caught George by surprise, ordering him to go back into his cell. He had no choice but to comply, but even locked behind bars again, the ruckus this caused prompted the town of Rawlins to rush into the jailhouse to help. When the public learned what was happening, Parrott likely realized he was better off trying to run from Rosa rather than follow her commands. A mob formed, and the cornered outlaw was no match for the town. His jail cell was reopened, his shackles refastened, and George was violently dragged outside. No more waiting. This bandit was going to be dealt with now. He was hustled to yet another telegraph pole where a noose was fastened around his neck, and the mob ordered him to stand atop an empty kerosene barrel. He begged, pleaded for someone to just shoot him and get it over with, but it fell on deaf ears. The rope was tossed over a crossbar, and the kerosene barrel was kicked over. The nightmare wasn't over, though. The rope snapped under his weight, and George hit the ground. No matter. The angry mob wrapped a fresh rope around his neck and once more forced him back on his feet, where he begged even more for a quick death. This time, the mob had George climb atop a 12-foot ladder to get the job done. Reluctantly, he did. He fell off the ladder, now much higher up, where he dangled helplessly. The execution wasn't particularly clean either. The desperate outlaw flailed, reaching for anything to break free. He wrapped his arms around the telegraph pole for some kind of relief, but it didn't do much to help. As Parrott's final moments drew to a close, the noose slid past his neck and across his face, literally tearing off his ears from the weight of his own body. At last, George Big Nose Parrott was no more. You'd think the story would end here, but if you can believe it, the hanging of George Parrott marked the beginning of a series of events that proved just as if not more macabre than the execution itself. Right there, amongst the crowd of townsfolk who watched the execution, were two doctors who took a particular interest in George Parrott and had a very interesting plan for the man's corpse. One of those men was Dr. John Eugene Osborne, a physician and an up-and-coming politician. The other man was Dr. Thomas McGee, a Rollins-based doctor and a surgeon for the Union Pacific Railroad. Osborne and McGee decided to claim the hanged man's body and use it for a series of experiments. But for reasons unknown, this experiment devolved into nothing short of a trophy hunt. Firstly, Dr. Osborne took a plaster cast of Parrott's head to serve as a death mask, a popular practice at the time. Then the doctors performed a medical autopsy on George. The skull was opened and split into halves by Dr. McGee so his brain could be studied. This was mainly in an effort to examine possible abnormalities that may have caused his criminal behavior, a testament to the era's limited understanding of mental health and reliance on pseudoscience. Oddly, McGee gave the upper half of the skull to his nurse, Lillian Heath, who would later become Wyoming's first female physician. The other half, as well as the majority of the corpse's bones, were put inside of a whiskey barrel and filled with a salt solution for preservation. The barrel was buried behind McGee's office in Rollins. But it was Dr. John Osborne who carried a much more disturbing fascination with George Big Nose Parrott. When Dr. McGee was done with the corpse, Osborne actually had Parrott's body skinned and used that skin to make a series of bizarre artifacts. For one, the doctor used Parrott's remains to make a medical bag for his own personal use. He intended to have the outlaw's nipples visible on the bag to prove it was human, but they weren't visible when the tannery completed it. Even more disturbingly, Dr. Osborne supposedly had the man's testicles repurposed into a literal coin purse or tobacco pouch. The most famous accessory of them all, though, were the shoes. At first, they looked like classic two-tone leather footwear, but they're not the usual leather. They're made of human skin. They were custom tailored to fit the doctor's men's size 8. Although they were mainly used as a dark trophy of sorts, the doctor did wear them sometimes. No more famously than he did when he eventually won Wyoming's race for governor and flaunted them at the 1893 gubernatorial inauguration ball. Osborne later kept the shoes on display at the Rollins National Bank behind a glass case where he was director. John Eugene Osborne went on to become the Assistant Secretary of State under President Woodrow Wilson. Nearly 70 years after this brutal saga, on the corner of East Cedar and 4th Street in Rollins, May 11, 1950, construction workers breaking ground for a building happened to discover the whiskey barrel still containing George Parrott's bones. The location was formerly the area behind Dr. McGee's office. Rollins gathered around the strange discovery, and suddenly conversations about Big Nose George were being had that likely didn't occur in close to 100 years. In fact, there were likely people still alive from that era who remember his crimes and lynching. One of those people being Lillian Heath, who was well into her 80s at the time. The former nurse to Dr. McGee and the first female physician of Wyoming still had the skull cap that the doctor had given her back in 1881, and the people wanted to know if it truly belonged to Big Nose George. When it was paired with the bottom half of the skull, it fit perfectly. In fact, later DNA testing confirmed that they were a match. What did Lillian Heath use that skull cap for all these years? She used it as an ashtray. Today, the skull, shoes, death mask, George's gun, and much more are on display at the Carbon County Museum in Rollins, Wyoming. The skull cap and shackles used during his execution are located at the Union Pacific Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. The medical bag made of the outlaw's skin has never been recovered, and rumor has it that the coin purse was initially displayed at the Carbon County Museum, but was later removed due to how graphic it was. What ended in a botched train robbery ended in a botched execution, and definitely one of the strangest cases of corpse desecration in history. Instead of being known for his crimes similar to the likes of Jesse James or Butch Cassidy, George Big Nose Parrott would go down in history because of a man he never met, Dr. John Osborne, whose sickly obsession turned just another outlaw tale into a twisted oddity. Parrott's time in custody was rife with fear and reckoning all the way to the bitter end. He, like Dutch Charlie and other members of his gang, met similar fates. But had he known what was in store after his death, George would have probably ran a little farther than Montana.